My name is Bill Leary. I'm the Vice Chair of the Public Interest Declassification Board, and I'm happy to welcome you to this public meeting of the board. Probably all of you know, but just to refresh your memory, the board was established by Congress to advise the President on the classification and declassification of government information. And our mission is to promote the widest and timeliest access to the formerly classified record of the United States government in foreign policy and national security policy and activities. I have only one task this morning. It's a very happy one to introduce to you the two newest members of the board who were a long time coming, but they were worth waiting for. First, to introduce an old friend, Judge James Baker, here sitting in the middle. Wave your hand, Jamie, so everyone knows who you are. I first met Jamie decades ago now when we were both at the National Security Council. I actually met him shortly before that when he was the counsel for the PIFIAB, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Shortly thereafter, Jamie became the Deputy Legal Counsel of the NSC, and after that, the Legal Counsel of the NSC, served throughout the Clinton administration, after which he joined the, let me find this, the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, from which he retired in July of 2015 after 15 years of service. How many as Chief Judge, James? Four. The last 4 years as Chief Judge of the court. In addition to that, Jamie has had many other jobs. Most importantly, I think, he served for over 20 years as a Marine Corps infantry officer. Even though most of that was in the reserves, it means that Jamie's probably in line for a high-level job in the Trump administration. So we can hope. He's also the author of 2 books, or in one case co-author, that are directly related to the work of the Public Interest Declassification Board. One is In the Common Defense, National Security Law for Perilous Times, and also Regulating Covert Action, in case you didn't think it could be done. Jamie has a whole book explaining how it can be done. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. Next, I am happy to introduce our new chairman, Trevor Morrison, who is currently the Dean and Eric M. and Lori B. Roth Professor of Law at the New York University School of Law. Previously, he was a professor of law at Columbia Law School, where, among other things, he co-chaired the Hertog Program on Law and National Security. Trevor spent 2009 in the White House, where he was an associate counsel to President Obama. Before entering academia, he was a law clerk to Judge Betty Fletcher of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the United States Supreme Court, which means that Trevor is probably not in line for a high-level job in the Trump administration. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Law Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the United States State Department's Advisory Committee on International Law. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Morrison, our new chair.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. This is my first public meeting of the Public Interest Declassification Board, and it's a real pleasure for me to be with all of you this morning and to welcome you to the meeting, both my first public meeting and Jamie's as well. So just a few opening remarks from me. I want first to welcome Alexander Joel, Chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I want to thank him for agreeing to be our keynote speaker in the public meeting this morning. And I also want to thank the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, for joining us this morning and for his welcoming remarks, which you'll hear in just a few minutes. Before that, let me just to frame our conversations this morning, sort of touch upon the reasons for today's meeting and what we as a board are hoping to accomplish through it. We all know that we are in a transition period for the government, and those of us charged with furthering transparency and open government objectives see an opportunity now to bring needed attention and leadership to the many challenges facing declassification and the security classification system more broadly. And the purpose of this meeting is to discuss with key stakeholders the way that the next administration can make progress in these areas. Specifically, when thinking of classification and declassification, we are seeking dialogue, comment, advice on what potential policy changes we as a board could recommend to further three related but distinct strategic goals. First is reducing overclassification. Second, improving declassification. And third, ensuring a credible and transparent security classification system. These distinct but linked strategic goals will be the framework within which we work this morning to solicit and share ideas, including about the executive order on classified national security information and how it might be amended, as well as to inform our thinking about the set of principles that this board has been studying and elaborating really for the last decade. So that's the frame for this morning's meeting. But to begin, I really am delighted to introduce the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, who will offer welcoming remarks and give us perspective on how the Archives is positioned to continue its push for greater transparency and open government. Mr. Ferriero is the 10th Archivist of the United States. He was confirmed into that position on November 6, 2009, and since then has led the Archives through structural transformation designed to better position the agency to meet its obligations as the nation's record keeper and information manager. I was mentioning just now to David that my wife is a librarian, and I think she now believes I've finally arrived professionally, that I get to meet the Archivist of the United States. With degrees in English literature from Northeastern University and a master's from the Simmons College of Library and Information Science, and also having served as a Navy hospital corpsman during the Vietnam War, Mr. Ferriero came to the Archives after leading the New York Public Library as the Andrew Mellon Director, as well as leading the libraries of MIT and Duke University. We're very pleased to have him here with us this morning, so please join me in welcoming David Ferriero.
Good morning and welcome to my house. It's nice to have you here, and a special welcome to Trevor and Jamie as you begin your new lives on the board. I'd like to also welcome all of you to the National Archives. I'm proud to serve now 7 years as the Archivist of the United States, and it's my honor to lead the National Archives as our government once again transitions power peacefully to a new presidential administration. I'm confident that the National Archives will continue to promote the preservation of our nation's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, and we will continue to make accessible government records we hold in trust for the American people. It is our joint mission to bring access to records of historical significance that I am pleased to host today's meeting of the Public Interest Declassification Board. The board plays an important role in advocating policy improvements that support greater public access to the documentary record of significant U.S. national security decisions and activities. The members have publicized the growing challenges facing government agencies in today's digital information age, a concern we share at the National Archives as our nation's record keeper. We at the National Archives strive to fulfill our mission and open government commitment to make access happen. A hallmark of a democratic society is the ability of its citizenry to question its leaders and have access to information about the activities of its government. It is more crucial than ever, given today's digital information environment, that those entrusted with holding government secrets do so in an appropriate and transparent manner. Vital to the success of NARA's open government initiatives is the continued conversation we share with our internal and external stakeholders. This engagement is essential to help us improve our services and help us serve our democracy by providing access to high-value government records. As many of you are aware, every new presidential administration traditionally amends the executive order concerning classified security information in the first year of a new presidency. I commend the board for bringing forth this public forum to begin the conversation with our mutual stakeholders about ways the executive branch may limit secrecy to the minimum necessary for our national security imperatives. This topic is timely and relevant, not just because we are in a period of transition in our government, but because we also are operating in an information environment where exponential growth of records requires us to reconsider policies and processes so that we may continue to serve our constituents now and in the future. The board is aware of these challenges and highlighted many opportunities for change in its recent reports to the President on transforming the security classification system and setting priorities, an essential step in transforming declassification. While our government contemplates the recommendations set forth in these reports, the board continues to press forward and look for ways to assist the Classification Reform Committee at the White House, of which NARA is a member, in planning for change in the years ahead. We at the National Archives will continue to promote limiting secrecy and making government information available whenever possible. I'm pleased to note the Director of the National Declassification Center, Sheryl Shenberger, will present comments this morning about the future of NDC and will provide her ideas for ways to empower the NDC's authorities and responsibilities to improve its declassification production here at the Archives. Sheryl's tenure as the first director of NDC saw the retirement of a 350+ million-page backlog of records and the establishment of a prioritization plan and work processes to manage the continuous accessioning of millions of pages of records annually to the National Archives from agencies across government. She has a unique perspective that will help inform decisions about the next executive order and shape the declassification activity across government. We as a government must modernize classification and declassification through the integration of technological tools, rigorous information management principles, and reforming the culture of risk aversion. The board has been a strong proponent of modernizing outdated policies and practices, often inhibiting access to our records, through its advocacy of a pragmatic government-wide technology strategy for managing classified information. Amending the executive order to consider technology more broadly and to approach policy from a 21st century perspective are the only ways the government will be able to sustain classification and declassification in the digital age. Modernization of classification and declassification policies and practices cannot occur without the support of our public stakeholders. Transformation will only be successful if we are able to work in an open and transparent environment that invites the views of all users of the classification system, both inside and outside of government. I'm proud of the National Archives, that the National Archives sees open government as an ongoing commitment to our constituents, and that our 2016 to 2018 Open Government Plan is a living document we can edit and amend through the interactive feedback and discussion features we have made available to the public. I'm also pleased that the senior leaders of my staff at the National Archives share this commitment to public engagement and participation. Our newest senior leader to join the National Archives is Mr. Mark Bradley, who was recently appointed by me and confirmed by President Obama to be the director of the Information Security Oversight Office. In this capacity, Mark will also serve as the executive secretary of the board, and I'm confident that he and the ISOO staff will continue to support the board in its efforts to recommend changes in the executive order next year. I look forward to hearing from the members of the public interest community and the board during this morning's dialogue, and I encourage candor and a robust discussion about ways we in government can improve our practices to better meet our users' needs. I'm pleased the National Archives already enjoys a healthy relationship with the public interest community and its leaders, and I'm excited we can continue to facilitate conversation around the need to improve declassification and better manage classified information as a government. In closing, I'm confident that our dialogue here today will bear results. In the world of classified records, NARA and the board must continue meeting our commitment to support innovative ways to make access happen. This morning's forum is one more step forward in transforming the security classification system and building public trust and confidence in our government. Thank you for your efforts to support our mission and our work, and thank you for participating in this morning's meeting.
Thank you, David. Next, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Alexander Joel, Chief of the Office of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency, or CLPT, for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI. Mr. Joel works to ensure that the intelligence community carries out its national security mission in a manner that protects privacy and civil liberties, and at the same time provides appropriate transparency to the public. As Chief of CLPT, he serves as the Civil Liberties Protection Officer, a position established by Congress in 2004. Reporting directly to the Director of National Intelligence, the Civil Liberties Protection Officer's responsibilities include ensuring that the protection of privacy and civil liberties is appropriately incorporated in the intelligence community policies and procedures, reviewing complaints of possible abuses of privacy and civil liberties in programs and operations administered by the ODNI, and ensuring that the use of technology sustains and does not erode privacy. In addition, Mr. Joel serves as the ODNI's Chief Transparency Officer, and in that capacity, he chairs the Intelligence Transparency Council and leads and coordinates the IC's efforts to enhance transparency consistent with the principles of intelligence transparency for the intelligence community. He's been at ODNI since it was stood up in 2005. He received his law degree from the University of Michigan and his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, and we're very pleased that he can be with us this morning. Alex Joel.
Thank you. I think I need to shorten my bio. I've been in this position since stand-up, as you noted, and it's been over 11 years now. So for those of you who don't follow the internal bureaucracy of the national security community carefully, and actually I think everybody here probably does, but the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created by a law, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, to better lead and coordinate the different intelligence activities in the country from all of the elements of the intelligence community. And the current count is 17. There are 17 elements. And so there was a sense by Congress that, implementing one of the 9/11 Commission recommendations, we needed to have a separate organization to help people share information and connect dots so that we wouldn't have a repeat of 9/11. And in that statute, they created the position that you just heard described, the Civil Liberties Protection Officer position. And I've been in that position since 2005. And more recently, we changed the title and changed the name of what I do so that we've added transparency. That's been a lesson learned in the last few years. We've always understood that transparency was important from a public trust perspective in terms of how we function in our democratic system of government. And what changed was really this notion that it was really an important priority for the intelligence community as a whole to have, in addition to protecting civil liberties and privacy and carrying out the national security mission. It's very important that we protect civil liberties and privacy, that we're subject to oversight, that we're open to our oversight entities, that we make sure that we have exercised fully our duty of candor with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, that we provide for oversight from entities like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and from congressional oversight committees. A lot of that takes place in classified facilities. A lot of that takes place by people that oversight is exercised by people with security clearances, and that's a good thing. So that way they can have access to our secrets and understand what the intelligence activities are under that rubric of secrecy. And what we found was that that was sufficient, that was necessary but not sufficient. It wasn't enough to just go through all of those oversight mechanisms as if they were always going to be conducted entirely behind closed doors. We had to find ways to be more transparent to the public so that the public better understood what it was that we were doing. And one of the things that I think that one of the lessons we learned a few years ago when there was a great deal of public swirl and debate about the legitimacy of different intelligence programs and activities that were being discussed was that we were scrambling to react to external events that were unpredictable for us. We didn't understand when something was going to happen and when the next demand signal would come across for us to release particular kinds of information to better inform the public and the public discussion that was happening at the time and still is happening, a very important one. And so we were in reactive mode, and this resulted in what I think of as piecemeal transparency. So we had a lot of documents that were issued a few years ago, very important documents, highly technical legal documents that had redactions and that if you looked at them all as an expert in context, you understood what they were about. But for the general public, we weren't providing enough context and speaking in a way that the general public could better understand what it was that these documents were conveying. So we had a recognition fairly broadly across the intelligence community, certainly at the intelligence community leadership level, that we needed to get on our front foot, that we needed to be more strategic and more proactive. And this is a cultural shift, I think, in the intelligence community in terms of how we act, and I think it goes beyond a particular program or a council or a document. It's something that I think is much more pervasive across the intelligence community now than it has ever been before, which is a recognition that we owe a duty to the public to increase their understanding of what it is we do, what our rules are, and how we comply with those rules, what the oversight mechanisms are, and what our mission is, and what our role is, and how we fit in. This is very challenging for a number of reasons for us. One of them is cultural. So I talked about a cultural change that's happening, in my view, my opinion, but there is also, of course, a culture of protecting sources and methods, and this is critical to the effectiveness of the intelligence community. Our effectiveness depends on our ability to collect information that is not otherwise available to policymakers, to analyze that information, to make sure that information gets into the hands of the people who need to make important decisions for our national security. And in order to remain effective at that core mission, we have to be able to protect secrets. But at the same time, we have to provide public transparency. So this sort of cognitive dissonance is something that we've been dealing with. And it's an important area for us to address in as many ways as we can. So what we're saying is that we need to find ways to exercise responsible transparency for the public while continuing to protect sources and methods. We're not saying that we should stop protecting sources and methods, of course. A fully transparent intelligence service would be fully ineffective as well. So we want to retain our effectiveness. So I'm just going to quickly give some background and status in terms of where we are now on some of these transparency efforts to better inform the discussion that you guys are going to have. We're very interested in hearing that discussion and learning from the different ideas people have regarding how to amend, for example, the executive order or other things. So a starting point for me, so I want to make, so part of what I was trying to do with that background is say that the starting point on transparency has been going on for several years now. In terms of the documentation and official things that we're doing, in February 2015, we issued the Principles of Intelligence Transparency. Those are on the website. There are 4 basic principles, and I won't go into them in detail, but the first one really addresses the what of transparency. What are we being transparent about? Obviously, we're trying to be more transparent about what our rules are, what our oversight is for complying with those rules, and what our compliance, how we're complying with those rules. But we also want to talk more about our mission and our activities that we think might be of public interest to better inform the public debate. So this is something that we're addressing, one of the purposes of that principle is to say, look, this is a broad principle of transparency. It's not just focused on legal concepts, which are important, but it's also broader than that. The second principle I call the how. So we're going to be more proactive, better speak more clearly and more understandably, meet the public where they are. So that means being more forward-leaning in terms of use of social media and other platforms, engage directly with civil society on a more frequent and regular basis, and we have been doing that, and I can talk about that more in a second. And the third principle is we have to still protect sources and methods. So we have to continue to follow the classification guidance, which you guys are going to be further discussing. But there are principles in that classification guidance that are very important. We have to apply those principles consistently and carefully. And if you do that, you will see, even in the existing classification guidance, that we're supposed to be applying classification markings very carefully. We're supposed to be thinking about how to write things at the lowest level of classification, how to write for release. We are not supposed to be classifying information that does not legitimately and objectively merit classification under the standards that are in the executive order, and we should certainly not be doing it to conceal things that are embarrassing to the public. So that's that principle. And the fourth one is really a mandate for us to go ahead and do it, align resources, processes, procedures to institutionalize all of this work. So those were the principles. In October, we issued an implementation plan, October of last year. It's a detailed plan. It's up on the website. We've been working to execute that plan. In April 2016, we chartered the Intelligence Transparency Council. I see some members of the council in the room, so that's great. And the council's mission is to coordinate and work with the ODNI and with their own agencies and all the various components in the different agencies that touch on intelligence transparency to make sure that what we're doing is coordinated, credible, consistent, and sustainable. And then more recently, we changed the name of my office, as we talked about. So those are some of the organizational milestones that we've had. There has been a lot of transparency, in my view, over the last few years. We've set up IC on the Record, which is a Tumblr platform. Hundreds of documents and statements have been released and posted on IC on the Record. Most recently, there was just I think yesterday, we posted a whistleblower training curriculum that's gone out to all government departments and agencies. You can see that it's featured. There's a fact sheet explaining what it is. We consulted with civil society as we were working on that, as well as other external folks. So that is up now on IC on the Record. We've created a detailed index of the documents and statements on IC on the Record. It's called IC on the Record Tracker. If you just Google ICOTR Tracker, Transparency Tracker, you will find it. And it helps sort of figure out what has been posted and gives you links to those things. There's a lot of Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act documents, policies and procedures for implementing Presidential Policy Directive 28, PPD 28, which was on signals intelligence. The Bin Laden bookshelf you can find linked to there as well, and links to other key documents. So I think there's a robust amount of transparency on that side alone. Other agencies have done and have been working on their own transparency initiatives. The CIA has released an enormous number of documents relating to presidential daily briefs. NGA has traditionally and even more recently more intensively engaged in significant public transparency with their intelligence products. So I think there's been a lot of work that's been going on. And then we've more recently on the classification side issued our addendum to the Fundamental Classification Guide Review, which called on agencies to examine how they can revise their classification guidance to promote certain aspects of transparency. So one of the things we highlighted there was asking agencies to consider a proactive discretionary declassification program. Another thing we highlighted in that document was to consider eliminating one of the categories of classification, the confidential one, and to see to what extent we could rely on secret and top secret as the two levels of classification. We've also adopted the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act Proactive Disclosure Program. So when we get a FOIA request, we not only respond to the FOIA requester, but we post that response publicly so that people can see, so that the general public can have that available. And we've supported USA Freedom. There's a bunch of things, but in the interest of time, let me just offer some more general thoughts on this. I hope you can see that there's a lot of work. There are challenges that we have in doing this work. It's costly, it takes resources, it takes time, and it takes attention, and it's inherently a manual process. Judgment calls have to be made on, and I'm thinking more specifically on some of the more recent declassification and release efforts we've been going through, on a line-by-line basis, sometimes word by word. So you have to make these judgment calls as to whether or not this information can safely be released. And those judgment calls have to involve the careful attention of the experts, the subject matter experts. And the subject matter experts are often the ones who are actually doing the work. If it's a current program, they're the ones who are actually involved in implementing and running that program. So you're pulling people away from their important national security priorities and asking them to, at the same time, make time to review these documents for transparency. We believe that transparency is important, but obviously their core national security mission is also important. So we have some resource constraints that are inherent in this approach. It takes resources, it takes time, it takes attention of experts. It takes a lot of work in coordinating and with all the various agencies and organizations involved. And it involves risk. There's a risk that we may make the wrong judgment call and something may get released that is going to be problematic from a national security perspective. So to me, when I was thinking about those things, I was thinking, well, from a private sector perspective, what involves risk? Anytime you invest in something, you're investing, you're dealing with things that are costly, time-consuming, resource-intensive, and that involve risk, and that's what investors do. And so I started to think about this as an investment. If we are thinking of the cost side of the ledger as an investment, well, then what's the return on that investment? Obviously, the overriding return is public trust. This is the right thing to do in a democracy, and I firmly believe that. But that's intangible. So what does that break down to in specific areas? I thought it'd be helpful to just think about those for a second. We're going through right now a discussion. We will be entering into a phase of more intensive discussions as the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act comes up for reauthorization. There will be a lot, I think, that will be discussed in terms of how that particular authority, and I won't go into the details of what that authority is at this moment, but how that particular authority is used, whether the rules are the right rules, whether they need to be changed. So this gets to the point that transparency and trust lead directly to whether or not the intelligence agency is able to perform its mission under the existing legal authorities, or whether those authorities are going to be adjusted and changed to meet changing conditions and expectations. So I think there's a direct link between this and the legal authorities and tools that the intelligence community needs to do its job. Another is to really get ahead, and it's a cost avoidance. When a myth or misunderstanding is perpetuated in the intelligence, in the general public discussion about what the intelligence activities are or are not, what intelligence agencies are or are not doing, that imposes costs on us as well. So we have to figure out whether or not where the myth came from or that misunderstanding, how to address it, how to correct it. And again, we're back in reactive mode, using a lot of time, attention, and resources to respond to something that is inaccurate, rather than having been proactive and providing the information up front so as to reduce the risk and the impact of any of those kinds of myths and misunderstandings. We have relationships with foreign partners that are important to this country. There are commercial trade relationships as well as national security and law enforcement relationships. Concerns about what the intelligence agencies are doing and what the national security community is doing can impact those relationships and can create costs for us, can increase friction, can also create problems for American companies. And we've seen that play itself out in the discussions with the European Union that have now resulted in Privacy Shield. So we were able to address the initial set of concerns that came out of the last few years and put in place a framework called the Privacy Shield, which allows companies to continue to do business in the European Union member states. This is, I think, very important for the health of our economy, and transparency is an important aspect of how we have been able to regain the public trust of folks in Europe, including those of the European Union institutions that were responsible for that. As long as I'm in this investment metaphor, and I'm conscious that we're running behind here on time, I was thinking as well, what are the market forces that we have to deal with? So whenever you have, if I'm going to be in private sector mode, I'm thinking, what are the market forces? There's supply, there's demand. On the demand side, I would say we have hard demands, which are legal requirements. They're requirements in statute, and there seem to be continuing to be considered and put in place that require transparency in certain areas. So we have a statistical transparency report that's required by Congress. We're required to review Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court opinions for release. There's the Freedom of Information Act. Again, this is a hard requirement. We are required by law to examine these FOIA requests, respond to them, and if litigation is initiated for a FOIA request, we're required, of course, to comply with a schedule set by the court that's hearing that particular litigation. And then we have the executive order requirements that that people are here to talk about, with mandatory declassification review, classification challenges, the automatic 25-year reviews. Those impose hard requirements on limited resources that we have to deal with. Then, the kinds of requirements I was talking about earlier, I would think of as softer requirements. There's the expectation for increased transparency, demands from different areas, the understanding that we have to better explain ourselves in order to make sure that we have the appropriate amount of trust to carry out the mission. On the supply side, in terms of the classified information, everyone here is very well aware that supply side is growing. With electronic, as the 25-year window starts hitting the era of electrons more and more, the volume that has to be reviewed, simply, how many emails do you write versus having to type the memo on a piece of paper? The number of electrons is growing at a very, very large volume in terms of what has to be reviewed. So some of what we hope to accomplish with these transparency efforts, and hopefully hear some good ideas about the executive order, is giving us more of the ability to optimize ourselves, our posture, our limited resources to deal with issues that are in the public interest, that are primarily in the public interest. Do we have the ability, do we have the space to figure out what is a priority and give that the attention that it deserves versus sort of being on a treadmill of compliance with different requirements that may or may not have a very direct impact on what is critical to the public interest at the moment. So it would be great if we had additional tools to manage both the supply side and the demand side to optimize what it is that we need to accomplish. I'll just say one more thing. I think that this kind of a session with the public, as well as the sessions we've been having with civil society, are enormously valuable. They give us an opportunity to better explain ourselves so that folks on the outside can understand where it is we're coming from and what we're trying to accomplish. And it gives us a better understanding of what people on the outside feel is important, where we can do better in terms of providing additional information or changing our own thinking and decision-making process internally. So thank you very much for this invitation, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thanks both for those remarks and for your work across many years now in maintaining this set of priorities within the intelligence community in particular. Now, next on our agenda is an opportunity for us to hear from a number of speakers, experts, stakeholders, users of the security classification system. So in setting up this public meeting in this forum today, we asked for participation from leaders in government and from civil society groups concerned with classification, declassification, government secrecy generally. We've prepared handouts that lay out the biographies of our speakers, so I won't spend time elaborating each of those now, but we do indeed, as the biographies make clear, have a very distinguished group of speakers. We're looking forward to hearing from them. So I'll give you the run of speaker order here and then turn things over to them, and they can come and present in turn. We will first hear from Sheryl Shenberger, Director of the National Declassification Center. She'll provide comments on how the NDC can improve upon its record now and in the future. Following Sheryl, we'll hear from Patrice McDermott of openthegovernment.org, followed by Nate Jones from the National Security Archive, then Eliziabeth Goitein of the Brennan Center for Justice, and finally Stephen Aftergood of the Federation of American Scientists. I'll say that in preparation for this morning's forum, we asked these leaders to provide white papers that summarize their recommendations and comments related to our 3 strategic goals, the leaders from civil society. And again, those goals are reducing overclassification, improving declassification, and ensuring a credible and transparent security classification system. We've posted those white papers to our blog, Transforming Classification, and we hope that others in the audience here have had a chance to read them ahead of the meeting or will look at them going forward. After we hear from our speakers, we'll then open the floor for comment either from any of my colleagues on the board or in particular from members of the audience here. But let's begin by welcoming our first speaker, Sheryl Shenberger.
Good morning. I see lots of friends out here that have been with us since the beginning of our center. And those of you who aren't friends yet, I'm sure you're just strangers I have yet to meet, and then you will become friends of ours. Many of you already know about the successes of the National Declassification Center, especially if you spend any time around me, because I am prone to rattle on incessantly about the responsiveness of the agency participants, the efficiency of the processes, the enthusiasm and capability of the NARA, NDC staff, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just going to recap that a little bit, and then I'm going to move into where I think we could go based on our successes. All of the declassification community working together meant that the NDC could meet that presidential deadline for addressing concerns with the quality of past reviews that presented their release to the public. Ultimately, a backlog totaling about 352 million pages, an awesome number in anyone's book. The lessons we learned in that effort have since been applied as we process other records accessioned to NARA on a yearly basis. So the declassification community will not fall into the quality assurance backlog black hole again. How did we do this? Let's look at 4 specific things. First, NDC implemented a flexible, streamlined process that did use a risk management approach to apply quality assurance and audit processes. This eliminated the endless cycle of re-review and second guessing, but it also recognized the need to take steps to address some quality issues with prior reviews. Managing risk smartly has been part of the NDC process since day 1. The more we've learned over the succeeding years, the more we've been able to apply risk strategies. 2, although the EO established NDC to primarily focus on permanently valuable classified federal records 25 years old and older, the interest in prioritizing presidential records, a common theme in PIDB reports, has our attention as well. 2 years ago, we set up classified terminals to support review of presidential records prioritized by the National Archives. A number of agencies are taking advantage of that efficiency by doing the Presidential Library Review in the NDC, where many of their reviewers are already posted. 3, to make the center more efficient and effective and address a PIDB concern raised in 2008 about expediting multi-equity review, we worked with CIA to set up an automated referral notification system. This allows us to ping agencies regularly about their deadlines. They have 1 year to review their referrals, as is set out in the executive order. I can tell you they've all met their deadlines. Finally, and possibly most impactful for us, the NDC embraced the power of metrics and of good data. This has been used to improve control of classified accessioned holdings at NARA and to help us best effectively track our progress and be able to report it out to you. We further improved information and control over classified series by working with other NARA components to create the Classified Records Accessioning Checklist in a Form 14130, which is now required as classified records are accessioned to NARA. What do these 4 elements mean in production results? I think we'd all agree the numbers are great. For the life of the program, we have completed quality assurance for 413 million pages, and so far have declassified more than 106 million. Nearly 8 million of those declassified pages were part of our successful Indexing on Demand program, where you direct us to the final processing of the record series you want most, and it within itself has an 80% release rate. The PIDB 2008 report specifically called out special media as worthy of attention, And in that non-textual category, we have taken 3,124 cans of motion pictures through our processes and declassified 1,318 cans so far. We have reviewed more than 500 audio videotapes and declassified 150 of them. We have reviewed 31 million pages of microfilm, and most of these are in our quality sampling step. And we have nearly 1.9 million pages of maps, charts, or posters in our other various final processing stages. A lot of what we've dealt with, both textual and non-textual, required page-level review or a reasonable facsimile accomplished by interagency teams and then followed by DOE's own page-level quality review. That's a lot of work in 7 years. 7 years of these lessons learned are pointing us to where we might want to go next. And like our successes, many of these were prophesied in early PIDB recommendations. We all know resources are an issue, so I am not going to speak to resources. There are other ways we can strengthen the national in the NDC name. NDC needs stronger authorities that result in expanded declassification community attention. Although I should be careful what I wish for, something as firm as that presidential memorandum when it said, "You will complete 400 million pages of a backlog," was an excellent motivator for interagency participation, assistance, and ultimately our success. NDC needs to exercise its influence to set declassification processing priorities, including the application of 25-year automatic declassification and the emphasis on maintaining archival provenance on accessioned historical series. As early as 2008, the PIDB was recommending prioritizing declassification based on historically significant information. This is a recurring theme in later reports and was especially emphasized in the 2014 report. Many researchers believe not all records are created equal and that requester prioritized significant historical collections should really go to the head of the declassification processing queue. However, researchers and requesters don't always agree on what is most historically significant, and the National Archives believes in supporting all of its customers' needs. Sometimes requesters want topic-based processing that just isn't currently supported by archival provenance requirements or record schedules. And the burden to identify topics within series is often resource-intensive. To address topic-based priority in a balanced way, NDC has provided special collections associated with World War II and Cold War events, remember we're 25 years old and older, that we could manage on a series level. In future, and working with the extensive requester community, historians, and other civil society partners, the NDC is well situated to identify series of greatest historical interest and to prioritize declassification processing. This is still not an easy process, and it is dependent on sound records management, security management, and declassification processing by other agencies so that we have good information about what is accession tenera. But it does allow for prioritization in an efficient manner that respects important archival principles such as provenance. To better support this prioritization, NDC needs the authority to manage and direct the work of other agency reviewers on site, as well as to exercise the authority to judge sensitivities, particularly as they apply to older accessioned series. The Center's efficiency in proving QA results should be reflected in reduced DOE levels of review, and therefore faster public access as well. Although Section 3.7 of the current EO directs agency and department directors to assign personnel to work at the Center to review and exempt or release information originated by their agencies, no guidance clearly defines NDC's role in regard to these personnel, and NDC often has minimal input into qualifications and work priorities, potentially undermining our tasking timelines and quality review results. While Center processes have scrupulously applied the directions of the DOE plan for review of record series accession tenera, statistics tell us that DOE is finding fewer concerns with the results of our interagency CIL review teamwork. That suggests our quality has greatly improved, and we need to recognize and reward that. Finally, although agencies are directed to revise and revisit their declassification guidelines every 5 years, revising doesn't always lead to realism being applied to their 25, 50, or 75-year exemptions. NDC process and subject matter experts who have the unique benefit of working with the classified equities of all agencies could adjudicate sensitivities from a common sense and practical view based on the content and the context of the hundreds of millions of pages in NARA holdings and the lessons learned by the NDC in its 7 years. NDC wants all reviewers to have a common baseline of knowledge and continues to expand and perfect an equity identification and reviewing curriculum, both online and instructor-led. Agency equity conferences are scheduled every 2 years. NDC facilitated the sharing of equity recognition information between agencies through our interagency QA team work. And agencies provide their equity guides to the center to satisfy the EO requirement, as well as the comment in the 2012 PIDB report on transforming the security classification system. After 7 years of successfully working together, it may be time to take the direction a step further with the ability to apply authorities in a limited way on behalf of each other, trusting that areas of uncertainty will be questioned and addressed to the proper agency accordingly. Maintaining a reasonable level of support and being able to exercise a reasonable level of control is paramount to any NDC future viability. And this could do more to streamline our process. Much as we have implemented an on-site presidential library review capability to support more efficient declassification, I'm looking at establishing a special on-site access review program to bring greater efficiency to FOIA and MDR case handling for accession records that are 25 years old and older. The success of the interagency work of the NDC suggests agencies could address these requests in an on-site collaborative center using their already on-site personnel, just as they do for the Interagency Referral Center. On-site collaborative review would reduce the time and resources needed to coordinate cases with off-site FOIA staff and could therefore make for a more efficient FOIA process. Farming out requests to multitudes of offices and departments means responses are unavoidably delayed, and there is the risk of inconsistent handling of equities. We would all benefit from a more centralized FOIA and MDR review and clearinghouse for records that are 25 years old and older at accession to NARA. The EO directed NDC to coordinate the development of solutions to declassification challenges posed by electronic records, special media, and emerging technologies. And the PIDB 2012 and 2014 reports also emphasize the piloting of new technologies. NDC has had success with dealing with and standing up special media formats and review. I gave you some statistics there. And there's been a successful pilot using Reagan emails and University of Texas research. However, while this is an important issue and one that needs further attention, electronic records volumes on a grand scale are not in the near-term future for the NDC. The NDC is in a highly textual world. By examining data about classified records stored in the federal records centers managed by NARA, we know that there are at least 278 million pages of classified records eligible for accessioning to NARA and processing by NDC during the next 15 years. And another 101 million pages are eligible for transfer after 2031. These numbers pretty much exclude the majority of the intelligence community, but the volume likely contains many of their equities. Is that my key that I need to shoosh? I'm almost done. The transfer dates for classified records are often longer than those of unclassified records. So while there is an assumption that we must now be reviewing classified records from the late 1980s and early 1990s, the reality is that the transfer to NARA and thus declassification processing lags. For example, in early 2017, more than 50% of the planned transfers date with records from the 1930s to the 1960s. With respect to the coming deluge of classified electronic records, NARA must be part of that discussion, especially as it relates to data and records management practices. But the development of future significant advanced technologies to support equity identification and declassification processing needs to be levied directly on the agencies who are responsible for the creation and generation of those classified electronic records. Declassification is not an option, it is part of the process. And the costs to develop and implement the tools necessary to fulfill our responsibilities to protect equity and to declassify information need to be considered as part of the life cycle and costs of systems. December 29, 2009. 7 years ago on that date, EO 13526 and the accompanying presidential memorandum established the NDC, laying out our parameters and providing our marching orders. During that 7 years, we have had noteworthy successes. We've also hit some bumps in the road that have made for excellent opportunities to learn and to adapt. Flexibility is our middle name. We consider our motto, releasing what we can, protecting what we must, to reflect our mission of making access happen for the most important historical records accession to the National Archives for safekeeping and research. The foundation of NDC's success of the past 7 years is in the partnerships with both government and civil society, my friends here today. It will require the continuing support of both to advance the NDC mission for the next 7 years. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Patrice McDermott, and I'm going to be shuffling papers a little bit here because I've been editing my remarks as we speak, as Alex spoke. So now let me find the first page. Professor Morrison, members of the board, Mr. Ferriero and Mr. Joel, thank you for this opportunity to share some ideas about steps needed to modernize the national security classification and declassification systems. And I'm starting a timer here so I don't go over. Well, maybe I'm starting. I'll keep going. As we all know, or most of us in the room know, Section 102(d)(3) of the National Security Act of 1947 makes the Director of National Intelligence responsible for protecting intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. A case CIA v. Sims said the director has very broad authority to protect all sources of intelligence information from disclosure. I hope to add to the discussion of reducing overclassification by pointing to the necessity of clarifying and delimiting the scope of classified methods. Let me stipulate that I believe sources are also seem to be overclassified, but we really can't tell because they're classified. And that's beyond the scope of my remarks today. I am not the deep scholar on national security classification that most of you in the room are. Let me first then address the clear problems and, in my mind and those of many in the reducing secrecy community, the dangers of overclassification of practices that are deemed intelligence methods. In the late years of the last decade and the first few years of this one, assertions were regularly made that classified methods were so intertwined with policy discussions that documents, in particular foreign intelligence surveillance court orders, could not possibly be declassified even in a redacted form. We have had confirmation since 2013 that these assertions were not true. They could not be declassified until they were. And I refer you for some of them to IC on the record. Moreover, bulk collections of U.S. persons' communications records, a classified method, were declared unconstitutional by a 3-judge panel for the United States Courts of Appeal for the Second Circuit. The FISC also found in several cases that the government's communications surveillance, classified as a method, was unlawful. In April 2014, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, known as SISI, voted across party lines to begin declassification of the committee's study on CIA's detention and interrogation program. And you can tell Bob I said the right name, also known as the torture report. The president promised to swiftly declassify the material that the committee submitted for declassification review. At the time, OTG noted that in order for that review to be meaningful, the president must assure that the CIA abandon its prior position that the details of detainees' torture are classified sources and methods. In terms of the defense of Guantanamo detainees, the stance that these were classified necessitated their lawyers to treat their clients' experiences and their memories thereof as secret information. In January 2015, the government modified its classification rules for the military commissions, the court system in which several Guantanamo detainees are being tried for war crimes. Under the new rules, the torture methods, the enhanced interrogation methods used in CIA prisons are no longer subject to classification, although any information that could reveal the locations where torture took place or the people who helped facilitate it remains secret. The December 2015 release of the 500-page executive summary of the Senate report detailed several of the intelligence agencies' so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, which had previously been secret. Up until this public release, the government's argument was that the entire program was classified. So although the 2015 modification is a step forward, problems with classification remain, and they continue because there is no clarity or delimitation. As Air Force Captain Michael Schwartz, an attorney for Walid bin Attash, another co-defendant in the 9/11 attacks, put it, when we say this is the tip of the iceberg, this is what we mean. When you compile a report that has a bunch of embarrassing facts about the executive branch, and then you send it to the executive branch for their redactions, what do you think you're going to get? Just in case we think that the broad latitude that the intelligence community has should satisfy them, and it's very broad latitude. Last year, right about this time, just as the FOIA bill, the House version of the FOIA bill, was going to the floor on the Monday, late that Friday afternoon, IC personnel went to House Oversight and Government Reform staff, who are not experienced with intelligence issues, and convinced them to insert language that said, and let me pull up the language. Let me pull up the language. So the FOIA bills added a presumption of disclosure, and the intelligence community was concerned that that would be read that classified information wouldn't be protected. That's not the case because there is an exemption for that, and there are statutes. Nonetheless, they wanted language put in that that classified information was exempt, and also that this was a rule of construction that disclosure of information would not be required that would adversely affect intelligence sources and methods that are protected by an exemption under the statute. Adversely affect is much broader than the language that has been available to the intelligence community. The term would have invited expansive interpretations of how it could be applied and could potentially weaken the standards for withholding classified information. Folks in our community were concerned that it would be far easier for the intelligence community to show that disclosure of a record would adversely affect sources and methods than to show that the disclosure of the same record would cause describable harm to national security. The other concern with the language is that it would apply to a B3, a by other statute exemption, in any statute, not just national security statutes. If the aim of inserting the language was to protect information relating to intelligence sources and methods, we said the bill should indicate the specific statutes, so not left open to interpretation. This provision in the House bill was one of the primary reasons that the Senate refused to take up the House bill. As has been regularly noted, so getting back, almost anything can serve as an intelligence source or method, including a subscription to the daily newspaper. And executive orders on national security classification have routinely extended permission to classify intelligence sources and methods. It is instructive to note that a predecessor order, executive order, EO 11652, issued by President Nixon in 1972, gave concrete examples of the sort of potential damage resulting from disclosure that would justify a top secret classification of information to be held. And they included compromise of vital national defense plans, or complex cryptological and communications intelligence systems, the revelation of sensitive intelligence operations, and the disclosure of scientific or technological developments vital to national security. And you can find this on Steve's wonderful site. The overbroad terminology and lack of specificity in subsequent orders has given broad rein, as I said, to the intelligence community. Indeed, 25 years later, Senator Patrick Moynihan, in the notable 1997 Moynihan Commission report, addressed this same issue. Underlying the rationale of sources and methods as the reason that information is kept secret is not the content of the information itself, but the way it was obtained. The public and historians want to know how it was used and what decisions it informed. Too often there is a tendency to use sources and methods language contained in the National Security Act to automatically classify virtually anything that is collected by an intelligence agency, including information collected from open sources. Senator Moynihan went on to say, clarification through issuance of a directive by the Director of Central Intelligence of the scope of and reasons for sources and methods protection would still ensure that sensitive information stays secret. At the same time, such a directive explaining the appropriate scope of that protection would help prevent the automatic withholding of all information that might relate in any manner, however indirectly, to an intelligence source and methods. National security classifications should protect our democracy, not shield government actions that, in my opinion and many of my colleagues, too often consciously and deliberately go around democratic practices and subvert constitutional protections. The vagueness and undelimited scope of intelligence methods needs to be rectified to ensure that it does not permit these uses, and I urge the board to engage seriously in this discussion, and I am hopeful that the new executive order and that the ODNI will issue some guidance in this area. Public guidance, ideally, so that we can hold the government accountable. Thank you. And my timer didn't set, so I hope I didn't go over.
Hi, my name is Nate Jones from the National Security Archive, and it feels like just yesterday I was speaking to a similar crowd, making jokes about the Pentagon Papers and declassification Mad Libs. But looking back, it's been a good 8 years. The former head of the Information Security Oversight Office, responsible for the oversight of the U.S. classification system, has acknowledged that classification officials joke that, quote, you could easily classify the ham sandwich. President Obama has summarized the tension between the public's right to know and the necessity for the government to keep some secrets as there's classified and then there's classified. Certainly, much work remains for the PIDB to meet its goal of modernizing the national security classification and declassification systems. Here, I suggest 3 achievable measures. Some could be achieved with even a few changes of words in the executive order that could reduce overclassification, improve declassification, and begin to rebuild the public's trust that documents stamped as secret actually contain information that should be withheld from the public. And going beyond what the PIDB asked us to talk about today, I'll quickly add that this costs money and it should be funded. And there's testimony on the Hill yesterday, and representatives were aghast at the price tag of national security information. And they were also aghast at the minuscule amount that went to declassification. And I would just add that in this free country of America, there's not a tacit agreement that anything secret is carte blanche secret forever. The tacit agreement is that when such things that taxpayers pay for are withheld from the public, they had darn well better be withheld as judiciously as possible and released to the public as soon as is necessitated. I think we all know that, but it's worth restating. So, on to my 3 suggestions. First, echoing much of what Sheryl said, and I'm in agreement with the majority of what she said. The executive order should improve the efficiency of the National Declassification Center and expand its authority. while I'm happy to hear that we are making gains on what the PIDB has called the wasteful, inexpensive, and ultimately unsustainable processes of multiple re-reviews of documents, pass-fail reviews where one classified word could cause a whole document to go to the back of the SCIF, and of Kyle Lott review are diminishing, the next executive order should follow that trend and make them diminish even less. And it should also accept the principle that's in this executive order, but in my opinion, often ignored, the idea of automatic declassification of when records hit a certain age, 25 years, 50 years. But we've talked about this tsunami of incoming digital records, and automatic declassification, as has been said before but not yet implemented, is really the only way forward, some type of automatic declassification. I take Sheryl's great idea that the NDC, when it's established that it's the premier, most efficient, and releases the most information declassification system in the U.S. government, I think it should take over FOIA and MDR. But another idea that she hinted at, but I would hint going further, if the next administration likes huge, monumental endeavors, the NDC should endeavor to declassify all declassified materials at all presidential libraries. The jewels, the highest level information that's available. Currently, getting a document declassified from a presidential library is, I wrote, the bureaucratic equivalent of passing a kidney stone. If no one has done this, here's what has to happen. You have to drive to the libraries, which are scattered across the country. Before you can even look in a box, you must file a Freedom of Information Act request. This usually takes years. Any class, and once you do that, they just tell you what's inside the box. They don't look at any documents that are marked as secret. For this, you must file a mandatory declassification review request. This takes years. And, as is often the case, if an overzealous classifier or declassifier, usually not from the NDC, but usually from another agency, often from another agency, marks these historic documents by definition, usually, as still secret, the review takes another year. It takes more years, and to go to the highest authority of ICECAP takes further years. And as proof of this, one document that my work finally got declassified from the George Bush Presidential Library, HW, took 12 years. Going back to the point of not carte blanche secrecy, and that if you say something is secret, you darn well better release it as soon as it's not working in practice. Maybe the NDC, I'm sure the NDC could expand its authority and make this happen. And a good, tangible goal that would be beneficial and would look great would be to declassify all presidential records that are declassifiable. Second, the incoming administration's executive order on classification should finally fully realize the Moynihan Commission's finding that the cost of protection, vulnerability, threat, risk, value of the information, and benefit from public release must be considered when deciding whether or not to classify or declassify any document. This means two things I want to talk about right now. One, it means that documents must be decided on their content, their threat to national security, the public interest, and other things, not whole classes of information. We learned this the hard way, as we spoke about with FISC decisions and other documents. Fortunately, in this administration, there's been one very positive example. Previously, the presidential daily briefs, his briefings that the president receives every day of immense historical importance, the intelligence community once argued that as a class, these documents are so secret that we can never let our adversaries know. We can't know what the president's thinking. Even if the information is mundane, repeated from newspapers around the world, as we now know, we just can't ever release it. It's the most secret document. Well, this administration proved that absolutely wrong, declassifying these PIDBs from the Nixon and Johnson administrations. Among their historical importance, they also showed that much of the intelligence was in fact gleaned from newspapers, and more theoretically, it showed that it's unacceptable to classify classes of information. The current executive order says that no information may be classified indefinitely. That means that you can't say that PIDBs, we don't have to look at them. part of it could be laziness. It also means that so-called operational files, we don't have to look at them. No. I suggest that we take the advice of the Moynihan Commission and look at every document on its merit and at the information it contains, not what class it's in. Second to this, the sub point. The current executive order includes a provision that states that properly classified information that is in the public interest, and if the disclosure outweighs damage to the national security, to national security harm that might be reasonably expected from disclosure. Let me repeat that. It says that in some cases, if the public good outweighs the national security harm of technically properly classified information, that information can and should be released. The problem is that the same executive order says in exceptional circumstances, and says that only the agency head or their designee can do this. What this means is that it almost never happens. What should happen, and what the next executive order should reflect, is the reality that we've already said today, that classification and declassification is subjective, and that these concerns should be made in every decision. And instead of having the declassifiers, who I agree with Sheryl are extremely knowledgeable, ask the agency head to release old information that is technically properly classified but really should not be, is unacceptable. One example, the fact that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended when Kennedy swapped out the Jupiters from Turkey secretly, and this was announced on Soviet radio, by the way, is still technically properly classified. Documents received by the National Security Archive have this blacked out. We will go all the way up to the appeals process. They're still blacked out. Look on the website. And while this may be technically proper, and classification guides say, yeah, do it, it's not morally justifiable. The next executive order should give the declassifiers the authority to declassify documents, one, that don't pass the laugh test, and two, whose declassification is in the public interest. Finally, my last point. The Public Interest Declassification Board should get into the declassification business. The board has done much good by issuing guidance and recommendations, providing a forum for public insight, and improving classification and declassification from the inside. But, at least in my opinion, it's done little to actually declassify any documents. Yesterday in the hearings on the Hill, Congress people said, well, who do we have to declassify documents if we don't trust the executive branch to do it? And there was some hemming and hawing, and several people said, well, you have the PIDB that Congress created, but they haven't done much. So either by executive order or maybe legislation, I suggest that the PIDB start getting its hands dirty. It should have the authority to compel an agency, maybe the NDC, maybe something else, to declassify the documents, including those referenced today by me and others, that it deems in the public interest, and there are very many of them. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Morrison and the board for having this meeting and for inviting me and the other members of civil society to participate. All of us who are speaking here today have worked very closely with the PIDB for years, and we greatly appreciate that this is a body that welcomes input and dialogue. I'm going to start by repeating an exhortation that I made to the board 5 years ago, and that is think big and think small. Think big in terms of the changes you're considering. Overclassification is not just a minor glitch in an otherwise well-functioning system. It's been a defining feature of the system for decades, and it's accompanied by many other major systemic problems, including inconsistency across and within agencies, arcane and burdensome procedures, and security breaches. No one inside the government, certainly no one I've spoken with, thinks that the current system works well. It needs a fundamental transformation. President Obama asked the PIDB to develop recommendations for exactly that, a fundamental transformation, back in 2009. The board consulted with members of civil society, and we felt that many of the recommendations that resulted from this process made good sense. However, they could not fairly be described as transformative. And as we've seen, they haven't been implemented. While there's consensus that the system doesn't work well, reaching consensus on a solution is a major challenge, which means that almost any reform proposal will meet with institutional resistance, whether it's transformative or trivial. Given that that is the case, I think that the PIDB this time around should take a different approach. If you're going to wake the genie, ask for what you really want. On the other hand, think small in terms of implementation. Steve, in his white paper on the PIDB blog, recommended proceeding with test beds and pilot projects, and I think that's a very good idea, certainly for some proposals, for two reasons. First, it's easier to get buy-in for a small pilot project than for a government-wide shift in policy. You might even find some components of some agencies that are eager to try something new on an experimental basis. Second, it's going to be important to have proof of concept for some of these ideas. If classification were a science, we wouldn't be in the position that we're in. And having these test beds will enable an assessment of what works and what doesn't. The white paper that I submitted lays out 8 reform proposals that I hope the board will consider. I should say that I also support all of the recommendations made by the other speakers today in their papers. I'd like to focus today on 3 of the proposals that I made in mine. My first recommendation is in some ways the most fundamental. I think it's time to consider tightening the criteria for classification. The standard of damage to the national security is simply too open-ended and malleable. The categories of classifiable information in Section 1.4 provide some insurance against an official going rogue and classifying the phone book, but they're too broad to be an effective check against the garden variety classification that happens every day in every agency. It should be possible to narrow these categories to some degree. In addition, the concept of national security is completely undefined. As Patrice was mentioning, and she mentioned this in her white paper, Nixon's executive order had concrete examples of what could constitute national security harm sufficient to justify a top secret designation. The current executive order doesn't have any guidance like that. And I bet that if I were to come up with a list of 10 bad things that could happen and talk to all of the experts in classification in this room, I would get widely different opinions about which of those constitute national security harm and what level of harm. Now, to be clear, I don't think classification can or should be reduced to a formula. As I said, it's not a science. Some amount of discretion and judgment is absolutely necessary. That's a feature, not a bug. But the almost unfettered discretion that exists today is not serving the system well. This task of making the criteria for classification more specific should be done by the people who know the system the best and whose judgment will be trusted within the agencies. My suggestion is that there should be a White House-led committee of senior agency officials tasked with tightening the criteria for classification and providing a working definition of national security damage. And there's already a structure in place with the existing Classification Reform Committee. Now, so far, I've obviously been talking about original classification decisions. Derivative classifiers shouldn't be exercising their own judgment or discretion on national security harm. They should just be carrying forward decisions made by original classifiers. That part of the system isn't working either. Derivative classifiers rely on having up-to-date agency classification guides that clearly delineate what's classified and what isn't. While the last fundamental classification guidance review made some good progress in terms of getting rid of obsolete guidance and consolidating guidance, there are still many problems that remain. 2 of the 9 agencies that ISOO audited in its last fiscal year report had classification guides that had not been updated for more than 10 years. And too many topics read more like lists of factors that the classifier should consider, rather than clear descriptions of the information that must be classified. The next fundamental classification guidance review is already underway, but it's not too late for ISOO to issue supplemental guidance. ISOO should insist on all guides being current as a condition for agencies relying on them. And ISOO should direct agencies to examine each topic in their guides with the following test in mind. If two different classifiers holding the same piece of paper and looking at the topic could reasonably come to different conclusions about whether there's classified information in that document, then the topic is not sufficiently specific, because despite what the executive order says, in cases of doubt, the derivative classifier will classify, and that leads to overclassification. My third recommendation, the last one that I'll discuss today, takes us back to the fundamental question of what information can properly be classified, and this one is about secret law. By secret law, I'm referring to rules, opinions, and interpretations that set binding standards for government conduct, but are withheld from the public because they're classified or for some other reason. The constitutional concerns implicated by secret law and the harms that result are different in kind and in degree from those that can flow from the classification of other kinds of government information. The executive order should recognize this reality and should treat legal authorities differently. If anyone suffers from crippling bouts of insomnia, I've written a 100-page report on secret law that includes, first of all, a handy 7-page executive summary, but more to the point, several recommendations designed to try to make sure that legal authorities are classified only in the most rare and compelling cases of necessity. These recommendations include substantive changes, such as requiring a stronger showing of greater harm, and procedural changes involving who will make the decision to classify this kind of information. So I won't go any further into that now, but I know that secret law is a subject that's of interest to many members of the board, and I hope that we have the chance soon to sit down together and discuss ideas for addressing it. So I'm going to stop now and let Steve take the podium. Thanks again to the board for having this meeting. Your job is not easy, and we appreciate the work that you do and the role that you play.
Thank you, Liza. Thanks to the board, thanks to the archivist for this meeting. The premise of this gathering is that the next administration is going to adopt a new executive order. That may or may not be true. Bush 41 did not. And in the past, when Democratic administrations have been succeeded by Republican ones, for example, from Carter to Reagan or going from Clinton to Bush, the incoming Republican administration issued executive orders that had an expansive view of classification and de-emphasized declassification. That's not the direction we want to go in. You know, the board, of course, needs to be faithful to its charter and should pursue its objectives regardless. I would like to make two specific proposals for possible changes in a new executive order. One is I suggest there should be a new procedure to enable requesting declassification of properly classified information. Right now, information that is properly classified is out of reach. It is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. It is exempt from the mandatory declassification review process. It is beyond the scope of classification challenges under the executive order. And I think that is not the right result. I won't argue why sometimes properly classified information should be released, but I would mention, as has been noted, The existing executive order does recognize that sometimes the public interest will outweigh the damage to national security, and that it should be released. The intelligence community, ODNI, has notably acted on that authority, but the provision itself is not operationalized. I can't go to anyone and say, look, I know this is properly classified, but here are the reasons it should be released anyway. And so I'm suggesting that there be such a procedure made available to members of the public, to members of Congress, and so forth. If you agree that that is a desirable option, then I would add that such a review procedure must be implemented by someone other than the original classifier. The original classifier presumably is going to be a classification expert, a security policy expert. They are unlikely to be a scholar, a diplomat, a journalist, someone with a broad understanding of the larger public interest. And in order to evaluate claims that properly classified information should be released, it is essential, I think, to take that decision away from the original classifier and present it to an independent third party, whether it's an ICECAP-like body, whether it's the Intelligence Transparency Council, whether it's a fortified PIDB, or an entirely new entity. A second proposal I'd like to make is, as Liza mentioned, to suggest the creation to suggest that the development of new information security policy and procedures be assigned to a particular entity in the government. If the next administration wants to make the classification system great again, so to speak, it's going to be hard to do on the basis of the Eisenhower-era structure that we are still living with. We need new options that we don't have. I've been through at least a few of these sort of what should the next executive order say, and we're always sort of reduced to tweaking the previous executive order. It's really not good enough. We need new tools. Somebody needs to develop and test those tools, and the development of the next classification system should be explicitly made someone's responsibility. One possibility is the DoD Strategic Capabilities Office I mentioned in my white paper. They probably don't want the job, but they are tasked with innovative information and other policies. There might be other corners of the government that would be well suited to that. If that's something you think has merit, then I would add that such a program should be granted a carve-out from the requirements of the executive order. In other words, they should be explicitly entitled to do things differently and in a manner that is inconsistent with the executive order. That's really what we want them to do. We want them to do things that are new and different and better, and more effective and cheaper and easier and more logical. So good luck with it.
Good luck indeed. Well, thank you to each of the presenters for offering your comments. So we now, in the time remaining, would open the floor up to a comment period to hear from others who want to speak, especially to ideas raised this morning. If any of my colleagues on the board want to offer thoughts, including emeritus members of the board, I'd welcome that now, but if not, we can open things to the floor generally. The microphones, let's see, we have one here. Ellen, is this the closest one? Okay, and we'll take it round. Yes, sir. Why don't you please identify yourself when you first speak? I think that makes sense. Thank you. Why don't you do that? Yeah. Do you mind doing that? Thank you.
My name is Jim Neighbors. Honest, it really is. My parents told me they didn't know who Gomer Pyle was when they named me. I'm a retired SES. From DOD. I ran the Air Force's declassification program, amongst other things. Thank you. This is actually the first one of these I've attended in a while. I was on NARA's ACERA program as well in the past. I have a few thoughts for you to consider. First, since I was the CIO for the headquarters of the Air Force as well, I'm a geek. I admit that freely. But the issue for me when classifying information in the past always was not how many equities were within a single document, but how multiple documents aggregated together to create a classification. That creates fear in the person sitting there deciding whether or not to classify something. But that's an n to the n-1 problem. It's something you cannot achieve humanly very easily to decide if document A plus document B plus document C, while unclassified, creates something classified. It's an age-old problem, I admit. So, I'm going to basically talk to the crowd here of the 4 people that just got done speaking. My request to you is that, as a community, we need to start requesting a leap. I heard someone say, think big, think small. I agree, think big. We need to take on technologies in which medical care, financials, and others, including the packages from Amazon that you just ordered to come to Christmas, are happening every day, and that's artificial intelligence. That is an issue that can take on this aggregation. Artificial intelligence is here, whether it's Google's DeepMind, Amazon, IBM Watson, take your pick. They're going to solve the problems of the issues for your cancers, my cancers that we're going to get. But these are the things that we need to be thinking about. Now, those tools have to be taught. What better time to take the people that know how to declassify things right now, like the Michael Benders of the Air Force that I'm very familiar with. Those are the people we need before they die off, forgive me, Michael, should be teaching these new tool sets how to declassify things, because we use them for training now. So my next question would be for the PIDB, how do you want to engage vendors in technology going forward? That is something we need to consider. 3, and this is a weirder one, I admit it. Is there a role for NARA in helping in the area of cybersecurity? And my reason for saying this is while we're declassifying things that are 25 and 30 years old, the world needs declassified cybersecurity information right now. And that is an issue where, yeah, not too many people had nuclear weapons in the past. Cybersecurity weapons are everywhere, they're proliferating, and they're hitting every one of us. Identity theft, what, 1 every 2 seconds, I think I heard on the TV just the other night. I'm not saying there is a role, but you guys are the nexus. You're where all the information comes to. So my question is there a role for this in helping the nation, helping the world better the whole cybersecurity instance? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. Other comments?
Can we respond?
I think we absolutely can.
So I'm Bill Studevant. I'm an emeritus member, but I have the task of chairing the technology working group. So obviously the whole issue of a paradigm shift in the direction of far-sighted applications of things like artificial intelligence, deep learning, advanced analytics, algorithmic-related tools that could dramatically help with the processes that we're talking about are on our radar scope when we talk about them routinely in our technology working group meetings, which occur frequently and have the benefit, by the way, of getting a lot of the constituents who are in the classification and declassification business in the room at the same time, so they actually know who each other are. This obviously needs to continue. It's going to be really important for the archives also to get their mind around the implications of the future of the digital age, and so there have to be some scaled-up programs essentially across the board. I noticed that Steve mentioned the SCO. I don't know whether you talked to Will Roper about this task or, okay, well, but I do believe that that recommendation, the kind of thinking that is implied in that, is consistent with the kinds of things that we're talking about. Of course, this is a big leap for the intelligence community and the defense community and every other community that classifies information, and how it ends up aligning with the processes that we're talking about, which I think is really, this alignment question is a really important question. We're struggling right now, obviously, with just tools for declassification, and we also believe that those tools might also be able to aid in classification as well. So there's a long road to hoe. We've been talking about getting big industry in. We're talking about big industry. We're talking about the Googles, the Amazons, et cetera, to essentially talk about this kind of challenge before us for the future. I think it's also important that all of you who have these policy concerns think and become familiar with the possibilities of this future world. And just to, for those of us who spend 80% of our time in the cyber world, I will say that the whole set of tools we're talking about here, AI, deep learning, advanced analytics, all the rest of it, are exactly the same kind of things that are driving the whole cyber world today in terms of defenses still being overpowered by offense. So there is a real relationship, but there's also a wave that we can ride in that regard. So, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jim David, and I'm from the National Air and Space Museum. As discussed in the PIDB's December 2014 report, the Automatic Systematic Declassification Review Program should really be aimed at the records of most interest. Now, that report recommends a topical basis. I personally favor simply high-level records of every agency. At the same time, whether it's topical or just high-level records, a redaction standard has to be used, and at the same time, as the December 2014 report states, a grace period has to be given the agencies for the lower-level records. They're much more numerous, they're of less interest, so on and so forth. So it's this trade-off. So, for example, Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery records are going to get a grace period of 10 or 15 or 20 years, but CNO and Secretary of Navy records are reviewed using the redaction standard. Second point I'd like to make is there's a lot of permanent classified records, 25 years old and older, that aren't at the National Archives. And to correct this, I think any new executive order, or absent a new executive order, some sort of directive, perhaps from ISU, NARA, I'm not sure, short of an executive order, has got to prohibit retention periods of 25 years or longer for permanent classified records. There has got to be a directive ordering that accessions that span many decades be broken up so that no accession of permanent classified records can be treated for record management purposes longer than 10 years. Break them up into 10-year segments. And then lastly, there are, as I understand it, some cases of agencies whose retention periods, who have records whose retention periods have run, but they simply refuse to transfer them to the National Archives. At the present time, I understand the National Archives has no authority to compel their transfer. And of course, we're talking about permanent records, whether unclassified or classified. So somehow or another, the National Archives has got to get the authority to compel the transfer of permanent records, whether unclassified or unclassified, when their retention periods have expired. Again, for permanent classified records, I don't think there should be any permissible retention periods longer than 25 years. And then lastly, and we don't know as members of the public, but we don't have a good idea of the record holdings at the agencies. We know what's at the National Archives. We know what's at the Federal Record Centers. And what we're really talking about here is WNRC and Suitland. We can go and examine the 135s. But for example, the NRO, established in 1961, has its own record group at the National Archives. There's nothing in it. Now, I understand a lot of NRO records, even from 1961, are sensitive, but there's nothing in the record group. There's no textual records, there's no photographs, no films, nothing. And it always leads me to think, what is the appraisal status of records at agencies, intelligence agencies, Treasury, FBI, so on and so forth? So are there a lot of, and I don't know the answer to this, are there a lot of classified records at these agencies? I think the answer is yes, that, let's say, are unappraised. They've never been appraised pursuant to a record schedule. I don't know. They need to be appraised because some of them will be appraised as permanent. Are some of them pending reappraisal, the same issue. So I think the executive order, in absent that, maybe the PIDB can somehow or another get some basic information from all the agencies that hold classified records as to the quantity of their record holdings, how many are unclassified, how many are classified, in their appraisal status. And that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just make one comment? Those are wonderful comments. Very perceptive. I personally agree with everything you said. I think most of the people on the board would agree with everything you said, and we have discussed many of your points. One part of our discussion, for example, in focusing on the lack of control over the declassification of records that are not in the custody, physical custody of the National Archives, that one possibility is they don't necessarily, there are sometimes persuasive reasons why agencies say that their records can't be transferred to the National Archives. And in the world of electronics, those arguments will probably get more and more compelling. But there should be a way for the National Archives to exercise effective control over the declassification of those records, even if they don't have physical declassification and public access to such records. Also, just one other quick point on your comment about priorities. We did, in our report, discuss topical-based priorities, but I think we all understand that there are other ways of establishing priorities, and what we're really concerned about is focusing on what is more important rather than insisting that everything must be reviewed without distinction. So, for example, as Nate mentioned, I personally, as one of my hobby horses, think that giving priority to the review of presidential records, which I think, presidential classified records, which I think almost everyone agrees are highly likely to be of interest to the research community across the board, should be a large part of the program going forward.
I think we have time for one last
Right, and
comment,
I'm mindful that we got about 4 minutes, and I think that's what I need. I'm Colin Agee. I work in Army G2, which is Army Intelligence in the Pentagon. I'm a retired military intelligence officer. I'm here with Alex Joel mentioned the Intelligence Transparency Council. I'm the Army rep to the council, and we've got some of my fellow council meetings here. We appreciate you having us here. That was a great segue on the presidential records, because there was something that Nate mentioned. So I want to make one comment that's historical and one that I'll address to Steve that's forward-looking. You mentioned the deal that was cut with Turkey for the missiles, and there's a wonderful documentary that I would commend to the group that was done, and I assume your folks declassified the tapes from the Kennedy administration, you know, the recording devices that got the most notoriety during the Nixon administration actually preceded that. And so the producer of this documentary, which is called Year of the Tiger, his name is Joe Lubies from North Carolina. Almost his primary source for this documentary were those recently declassified tapes. So he made that theatrical by adding video and still photos and did a really compelling, I think it's 55-minute documentary. So if you're interested in this and the fruits of the declassification. This is a wonderful historical product that was a result of some of the lessening of the reins on those documents. I wanted to briefly mention, Steve, I do work more so than on transparency on innovation. So I do work with Will Roper and the SCO. So I just want to maybe clarify, if you're suggesting that Steve recommend technology that would help us do this better, I think Will might be amenable to that. If we suggested that his office take on declassification, his head would probably implode because he's very focused on technology, and it would be out of his lane. So just an observation from somebody who works with him. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone for being here this morning. Thanks especially to our speakers, the presenters. This is, as I say, for Jamie and me, our first public meeting, but we certainly hope that all of them will be this substantively helpful. I think that I can speak for the entire board when saying we do mean to set an ambitious agenda. The sort of strategic priorities we've laid out are not just moving around deck chairs on the Titanic. They're not just small marginal changes. They're at least trying to not take it as given that the only kinds of reforms we could recommend would be of that sort. And that we do think, whether it's through real investigation into what new technologies could bring, or even trying to spur the kind of reconceptualization of the building blocks of a security classification system itself, that those are within the work plan of the board going forward. And I think we've really been helped in ways both to think big and to think small today. Thanks again. Thanks to our keynote speaker. Thank you to the archivist for being with us. Thank you to all of us. And our session is closed.